One of the domains where language seems to be critically significant is education. We are going to see the role of language in education today in understanding relationship between language and society. As you know, there are several domains of language use in society. In fact, we can classify society on the basis of the various domains of language use. One such significant domain is education, and we want to see how it works, that is, how language works in the domain of education for us to understand the relationship between language and society. The 3 to 4 points that we are going to be looking at today are relevance of linguistics insight in education, the role of language in education, and then we will briefly touch upon the question of standard and non-standard and the question of English in education at the end. The role of linguistics insight in education, in short, is immense. There could be a lot of technical examples that we can draw upon. There are a lot of such technical examples that we have seen. For example, just to mention one example before moving on further to look at how education works in how language works in education, is the role of plural formation. See, various languages across language families will have plural formation processes in them. Take an example of Telugu or Malayalam or Hindi. Telugu has one specific set of plural formation. Malayalam has another specific set of plural formation, and Hindi has yet another specific set of plural formation. To give an example of each one of them, what we see is all these plural markers. For example, lu in Telugu and kal or gal in Tamil and Malayalam, and a or zero or a or a in Hindi. Now, if you look at these patterns, what we understand that to arrive at these patterns, the broad patterns in different languages of different language families, it will not be possible to look at such a thing without the insights that come from one of the branches of the study of language, that is linguistics, and the name of such branch is phonetics and phonology. In Hindi, the plural marker is a in masculine nouns or no plural marker in masculine nouns. That is to say, when a word ends with a vowel a, then the plural marker is a. If a word ends with anything other than a and it happens to be masculine, then there is no plural marker. A plural marker is a with little bit more morphological modifications, and a in feminine nouns, and that happens to be the pattern in Hindi. Now, if you want to look at further generalizations, what you see is plural markers in Hindi is a vowel. Plural markers in Hindi happens to be nasalized in the case of feminine and not nasalized in the case of masculine. Similarly, the distribution of where kal appears as a plural marker in Tamil and Malayalam and where gal appears as a plural marker in Tamil and Malayalam. Malayalam has got more than one plural marker, and the distribution of such plural markers in terms of where they appear, which one is unmarked, that is, which one appears in more contexts and which one appears in a restrictive set of contexts, and similarly to Telugu and many other languages, we can arrive at such precision only if we look at, if we bring in insights from the study of language. Such is the relevance of linguistic insights in education. But linguistic insights in education is not restricted to that. When we look at the role of language in education, we get to understand the relevance of linguistic insights in education in little bit more details. So, to examine that, we will move in a slightly different direction, and that happens to be, when we want to understand language, there are several things that we can say, and probably all of them are going to be true, but we need to say things about language that are contextually relevant. One of the things that we can say about language is it's a system of rules. You have just seen an example of how precise rules work, and such a precision is possible to arrive at only when we equip ourselves with the linguistic insights. It's a shared set of verbal codes, requires elaboration, but pretty much evident. Looking at language from social perspectives or from the perspective of application, we can say language is a general communicative phenomenon. Now, from both the perspectives, and particularly from the third one, Halliday 1980 looks at the relationship between language and education, and he finds three broad domains. One is the domain of language learning, the other is the domain of learning through language, and finally learning about language. He emphasizes that each one of these domains, each one of these perspectives for examining relationship between language and education is going to be relevant for the understanding of how it works in the larger domain of education. Elaborating on each one of the three, where Halliday comes in, and we want to discuss how educationists and linguists have said things about the relevance of the study of language for education. Examining the three aspects, that is, learning language itself, learning through language, and learning about language, Halliday concludes that learning about language is learning the genesis of learning itself. That is to say, if we want to understand how learning takes place, that is how learning of anything takes place, we need to understand the genesis of learning itself, which is located in how we learn language. I invite you to read this paper by Halliday, and insights from this paper are pretty significant in understanding the entire domain of education and how the domain of education sees the role of language and its relevance in it. Another anthropologist by training, Shirley Heath, in 1984 made some observations, and some of the striking observations are the following that you see on the screen. The disciplinary boundaries will be broken for the study of language. That is to say, the study of language contributes, is immense. It helps us understand wide range of disciplines and how they work vis-a-vis language, particularly when we want to evaluate the role of language in education. she points out that the root ideas in diverse disciplines such as cognitive science, literary theory, language planning and communication theory carry basic information from linguistics, and that can be said to underline the significance of or the relevance of the study of language in the domain of education. And if that was not enough, she finally makes a prediction, and which happens to be absolutely correct 30 years down the line, that the research domains ranging from computer science to industrial sociology, the science of language is going to be central. The knowledge about language that has come from linguistics is in the process of becoming a matter of general knowledge, like certain principles of mathematics, physics and biology. It is not pretty difficult to understand, pretty simple idea, and she is only trying to use the analogy to convey the point. Findings in linguistics about language are going to be very relevant in understanding wide range of disciplines, and that is why she believes the disciplinary boundaries will be broken. You need to understand as technical stuff as it gets, something like how machines work in computer science, and to understanding sociology and all the way to industrial sociology, we need to know how language works, and such is going to be a central element. Agnihotri 2007 and in subsequent writings, things that he has talked about before 2007, comes to a point where he very emphatically makes the point that it is language which constitutes humans. In other words, language is the capacity which is constitutive of humans, which defines humans. Now, when you see what Halliday has to say, who is a linguist and educationist, both Sarla Heath, who is an anthropologist and in particular educational anthropologist, and Agnihotri, an educationist, a linguist and a social scientist, what these people, and these are just few examples. When you look at what these people have to say about the study of language, it becomes pretty evident how the study of language is relevant for education, and the specifics of that relevance and how the technical understanding of such domains, such ideas are going to be helpful to us is what I have described to you just now. Moving on to understand the entire domain of education and also how language interacts with that, I would like you to look at some more. In the domain of education, school happens to be one of the big things. That is the center for education, and we would like to understand this little bit again from various perspectives. So, Heath again points out that school is a place where young minds learn and develop much of their sociolinguistic competence and repertoire. That is, it is a place which does to young human minds at a very early stage, which is not possible to measure. The kinds of things that happen to us in schools are immeasurable. Competence and repertoire in the sociolinguistic context of its performance develop side by side in a very complex way in schools. Children grow in school learning things that they do not consciously realize, and that is what is called learning, and this is related to what Halliday was talking about, the genesis of learning is embedded, that is, the understanding of genesis of learning is embedded in understanding of how language works. So far that you have seen, the way humans learn language is different from how human learns other aspects, other things. And this is why we have been emphasizing that the learning of language is what makes language a special purpose cognition. The learning of language happens effortlessly and in not conscious fashion. All other kinds of learning takes place with a conscious effort. So, with that distinction in mind, where learning is really not a conscious process, and particularly the learning that takes place in schools is not a conscious process. And probably on the basis of these, educationists and linguists have said that what children learn in school is immeasurable, in the sense that children learn much more than we think we teach them in schools. It's from variety of perspectives, all sides, and such learning is never restricted, the nature of learning cannot be restrictive, and therefore, as a concluding thing, we can say the genesis of learning lies in understanding the learning of language. So, for Heath, schools bring a growing sense of dissonance between transmitted knowledge, which help children shape their identity, and subsequent transitional experience learning. The language of children is heavily influenced by academic and social cultural that they come to interact with in the schools. Now, focus on transitional experience, that is subsequent transitional experience in the process of creation of identity and construction of knowledge. So, construction of knowledge, creation of identity, and subsequent transitional experience are the parts of processes that take place in schools. And that is why it's such a significant space, and that is why such a significant space needs to look at the genesis of how people learn language, because understanding of this not so conscious process of learning requires understanding of how language works. It's an interesting site to explore the development of new practices, in particular sociolinguistic practices. And all such development of identity and construction of knowledge and subsequent transitional experience are part of sociolinguistic practices. That is what is the significance of a school in education. The effort to underline significance of schools in education is located in the efforts of understanding the function of language, that is, from both language as a system by itself and language as a social entity. So, when we look at the language of education, we need to start with certain basic ideas. It was a common notion that education system ought to be monolingual, in the sense that the use of one language is the only option in schools. Now, this was fundamentally not in sync with how society works. No individual or no society works just with one language, and this is the point which we have emphasized in the duration of this course again and again. Therefore, I assume that we understand the context in which we say no society is monolingual, no individual is monolingual. Hence, the idea that a system will operate solely on the monolingual hypothesis would not work. However, that was the general common notion, common understanding about the space called school that we have discussed and the medium of instruction. However, another interesting point to add, which we have underlined earlier, which we have discussed in details earlier, and we want to underline through the understanding of this, is in the early 60s, Chomsky raised the question of learnability in children. Though he does not locate his hypothesis in the boundaries of schools, but the question of learnability in children was emphasized for the first time with such seriousness that it required, and with we say such seriousness because when we look at the consequence of this question and the way it has transformed our understanding of language in schools, is why we can say that the question about learnability in children was raised for the first time with that kind of seriousness. In particular, that was about the learning of language. And he demonstrated with empirical evidence that children learn a complex system of language in no time on the basis of the limited and degenerate input. Prior to Chomskyan intervention into the understanding of learning of language, researchers focused and believed that the input is proportionately responsible for the output in the process of learning, and such research focus completely ignored the generative capacity of human mind. Now, all of these things, the generative capacity of human mind, the significance of understanding of human behavior as well, at the same time the question of learnability in general and the question of learnability of language in particular are all in total sync and provide an understanding for how language would work in the domain of education and its role and significance. When we evaluate the role of language in understanding education, and also we look at language from the perspective of education, we come to two very significant names. They are Bernstein and Lebab. There were differences among these two. However, their contributions have led to a great deal on how we understand language in education and language of education. Bernstein came up with two terms. They were restricted code and elaborated code. I invite you to look at the genesis of this discussion about Bernstein and the two types of codes that Bernstein talked about. And also I want you to evaluate in larger details the relationship between Bernstein's deficit model and Lebab's variability model. We will be presenting in brief the two things. Bernstein defines restricted code as the patterns of language the working class users have. Restricted code includes poor grammatical construction that are often short, simple, unfinished, few conjunctions, little subordinations, dislocated presentations of information, and limited number of adverbs, adjectives, infrequent impersonal pronouns subjects, and frequent comprehension requests. These are the features of restricted code. I want you to read this thing carefully and elaborate on what restricted code was meant by, what Bernstein wants you to understand through the use of restricted code. And I would want to add that if not then, now it certainly refers to language that people speak in the real world. We will see the significance of a discussion on restricted code and elaborated code when we are going to look at the next aspects in this course. But for the time being, please understand that restricted code and the features that are listed here only indicate to the language that people use in the real world. Whereas, he brought another term in contrast called elaborated code with, if we compare the two, with a sharp opposite features such as advanced syntax, that is standard syntax, complex sentences with subordinate clauses, prepositions, wide range of adjectives, adverbs, and a lot of qualifying elements of language. Typically associated with the middle class, can be associated with higher class as well. Schools use elaborated code and expect students to use it. That is to say, schools, the language of the school is elaborated code. And if we want to do the mathematics, the language of the school was going to be or ended up to be the language that is not spoken in the real world. And this has consequences which we will discuss little later. But this two significant points that we draw from this: language of the school did not remain the language the way commonly people use in the real world, and language in education became, or at least was believed to be so, in a serious sense, monolingual practice. So, this had its limitations, but because you see, the variation within language is a natural phenomena, is the nature of language. So, restricted code is as rich and rule governed as any other language, and that is why what Bernstein concluded on the basis of restricted code and elaborated code distinction in terms of what is known as deficit hypothesis was problematic, and given the nature of language, what replaced it was variability hypothesis of Lebab, which help us establish that the language of the school cannot be located in monolinguality, which is only a hypothetical concept and cannot be anything other than the language that people speak in the real world. In other words, not elaborated code, but restricted code. And we will look at this distinction with more scientific evidence little later as well. We looked at the beginning of this discussion that we will be talking about the discussions of standard and non-standard as well. At another point where we have looked at the discussions of standard and non-standard language was a discussion on English in India, was a discussion on language and dialects, the context of language and dialect in society. In this context, what we want to say, we have established that the distinction between in terms of standard and non-standard is technically a fictitious one that does not hold its ground, and that comes apparent in variability hypothesis by Lebab. Coming to the question of English in education, and that also in particular in Indian education system, we need to understand, which we have looked at before, that English happens to be markers of identity, mobility and superiority. some of these terms may not sound very acceptable, but nonetheless, these things are associated with English. It is also the fact that English represents elaborated code. And to understand this, one needs to look at details on English Education Act of 1835 by Macaulay. That helps us understand how English was roped in education system. And finally, when we look at Constituent Assembly debates, we get to understand the complexity of language in society, and thus has got huge significance for how policymakers and practitioners need to be aware of both study of language and the domain of education in the society. Thank you.